In this video, we are going to discuss asynchronous programming in JavaScript. The idea is the following. Sometimes you want to execute a piece of functionality that resides outside of your application. Like for example, when you consume a web service, the web service is outside of your JavaScript application. So, meanwhile, that web service is processing your request, your application should not come to a halt, should not just stop. Your application should do other things. Meanwhile, the web service is processing the request. And then, when the web service finishes and sends a response to your application, then your application should stop whatever it's doing and process the response of the web service. That is basically the gist of asynchronous programming. Your application can do something while it's waiting for something else outside of the application to finish. There are ways to do asynchronous programming by waiting asynchronously for something to happen inside of your application, but that is outside of the scope of this video. So let's see an example. Let's say that I want to consume a web service from a JavaScript code. Here we are in an HTML file. As you can see, there is basically nothing in it. So let me say function consume web service, and I will say here fetch. I will use what's called the fetch API. With the fetch API, I can make HTTP requests from my JavaScript application in a browser into another web service or web server. I will paste the following URL, which is used for making examples that consume web services. Now, as we just said, we are going to make an HTTP request to this web service. While this operation is being taken care of, our application should not stop. But how does my JavaScript application know that this will not return immediately? Well, because of the promise response that you can see on a screen. A promise in JavaScript represents a value that will be fulfilled in the future. So then JavaScript knows that this fetch operation may not finish quickly, and therefore it should just not wait for it. The application should not stop working just because it is waiting for the fetch operation to finish. It should instead do other things so that the application doesn't freeze. Now, how do we indicate that we want to do something after the web service responds to our application? For that we can say .then. Then allows me to pass a function that will be executed once the fetch operation finishes successfully. And notice that I said successfully because we're going to learn how to deal with errors in just a moment. But first I want to say here response. I want to pass a lambda function or an arrow function into this then, so that I can say, for example, response JSON. What am I doing here? I am taking whatever response I am getting from this fetch operation, and then I am applying the JSON function to that response so that we are transforming the response into JSON. Now, if you see here, JSON also returns a promise, and therefore this is also a asynchronous function, which means that we can say here then one more time, and here we are getting a JSON, and I can just console log that JSON or do whatever I want with it. So what are we doing here? We are saying fetch please, which means make an HTTP request into this URL, and then in the future you are going to get a response, and when you get that response, I want you to invoke this function that I am passing you here, and what that function is doing is taking that response and executing a JSON function which itself is also an asynchronous function, which means that we can use then one more time so that when that function finishes, we are going to execute this function that we have here. And what we are getting is a JSON representation of the response of this HTTP request that we did here, of the body of the HTTP response of the request that we just made, and then we are console logging that. Let's see that. Let me come here and say consume web service, and I want to right click here and use open with live server, which comes from an extension that we installed in the past, which is extensions live, which is this extension that we have here. Just in case you forgot to install it, here it is. Now let me go back here, right click, open with live server, and as you can see we have our page here. If I press F12, you are going to see that we have an object, and this object has some information, and that information is what comes from the web service. Now, something that I told you before is that we were going to see how to handle errors, because then is only invoked when the operation was successful. But what if I made a mistake and I changed this to X, for example, HTTP X? Let me save and let's come back here, and you're going to see that we got an exception, of course. But what if I don't want this? What if I want to do something in case of an exception, something special? I can come back here, and after this then I can say .catch. Catch means that this will be executed in the case there is an error with the promise. Remember that fetch returns a promise, and if there is an error with the operation, then this catch will be executed. And here I can say error, and I will just say alert, something bad just happened, and we're sad about it. And that's fine. Let me save, and let's come back here, and you're going to see that we get the message displayed here. And of course, if we fix the error, HTTPS, save, and come back here, you are going to see that we only get the JSON log in the console and not the alert here, because catch only runs when there is an error. Now, this is all good and fine, but it can be a little bit difficult for some people to read this, fetch, then catch, then. There is a better way, at least better in my opinion, of course. If you prefer this, then you can definitely go for it. But you can use something called async await to simplify the way we deal with asynchronous programming. Let's see an example. I will say async here, function consume web service async. So this is a new function, and this will do exactly the same that we did here, but without using then and catch, and just using async. When I mark a function as async, it means that I will use asynchronous programming with it, but the idea of marking it as async is to be able to use the await operator. Let's use the await operator, and I will explain you what it is. I will say here const response equal to, and I will just copy this fetch from here and paste it here, semicolon here, and say here await. What is this await about? Await allows me to indicate to JavaScript that this is an asynchronous operation, right? So I only want to continue the execution of this function when this asynchronous operation finishes. So this await means asynchronously waiting for the fulfilling of this fetch request. And then I can say here const JSON await response.json, because remember that this JSON function returns a promise, and we have to await the promise in order to continue with the execution of this function. And then after that I can say console log JSON, which is this variable that we have here. So as you can see, this function is exactly the same as this one except for the catch, which we are going to solve in just a minute, but they do exactly the same. But with async and await, we can program in a way that feels like it is synchronous programming, but because we are using the await operator, then we are asynchronously waiting for the execution of this asynchronous operation, this fetch that we have here, and the same for this await response JSON that we have here. Now, I told you that we were going to include the catch here, so for that we have to say try. We're going to do a try catch. A try catch allows me to execute some custom functionality in the case of an exception. So I will say here catch X here, and in here I will do the same thing I did here. I will just copy this alert and I will paste it here. And again, these two functions do exactly the same thing. The only difference is the style in which they do it. This one uses then and catch, and this other one uses async await. Let's test this one. Let's test this. I will comment this out and I will put here consume web service async, and I will come back to Chrome, and as you can see, everything is working. And if I change this to X and I will save and I'll come back here, you are going to see that we once again have the same alert, which means that indeed these two functions are exactly equivalent. The only difference is that one uses then and catch and the other uses await. But it is on you which one you prefer to use. I personally prefer this one because it feels easier to read, but the choice is yours.